Hi, welcome to our webinar. I apologize for yesterday. Something happened to the Wi-Fi over here and I was unable to get online. Thank you for your patience and for joining. And I have an Ethernet cable plugged in today, so nothing should go wrong, hopefully. So let's get started. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. And go here from the beginning. And this is a topic that is of great interest to me. How Edsel Ford and Ford Motor Company saved World War II. World War II. That might sound a little over the top, but I hope as we go through this, you'll see Edsel's dedication and what Ford Motor Company accomplished, what a lot of the manufacturers of automobiles during World War II accomplished is amazing. On December 29th, 1940, President Roosevelt read a speech over the radio to encourage United States companies to make military supplies for Great Britain. During this fireside chat, he coined the term arsenal of democracy. And the arsenal of democracy is the allies that we're going to help out, but at the time we were told we were not entering the war. The address took place 1 year before Pearl Harbor in the United States entry into the war. The phrase arsenal of democracy soon became synonymous with Detroit and the area's car makers, which became a military manufacturing center. The Army Air Corps only had 1,300 combat planes. They were all outdated, while Germany was making 18,000 cutting-edge aircraft a year. So we were not prepared to be in a war. And before I talk about this, I just want to go over something briefly with you, because a couple of names are going to come up here. And when people credit Henry Ford for making the B-24 Liberators, Henry Ford had nothing to do with it. You'll find out more later, but I will tell you that that was all from Edsel. And I have to talk about two people coming up later on. I didn't make a slide for this, but I just want to mention Henry Ford and read a little something to you that he had gotten the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler, as had Charles Lindbergh back in 1938. And they refused to return them. Now Hitler is on his way up to power, and both Ford and Lindbergh were known for their anti-Semitic views. They joined something that was called America First. They didn't want us to enter the war because they are both pacifists. But beyond that, clearly, in my opinion, America First also had some Nazi leanings favorable towards Germany. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go along. And eventually both men disassociate themselves with America First. I don't know if they ever disassociate themselves with their anti-Semitism. Yes, Ford publicly apologized for his newspaper that was an anti-Semitic newspaper, but did his other views ever really change? I'm not sure. I would think his actions would lead me to think that they did not. All right, on to the slides. So President Roosevelt is going to hire William Kunston, the president of General Motors, to oversee defense manufacturing. Edsel Ford and Ford Motor Company manager Charles Sorensen, and he's the production manager, met with Kunston in June of 1941. And they agreed to make 9,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engines for the Allies, for Great Britain. But when they returned to Detroit, Henry Ford canceled this order because he thought that wars were unnecessary. I don't think any of us think wars are a wonderful thing. And he didn't want America involved in Europe. And in my opinion, you can believe not getting in a war, but if you feel like World War II, well, you'll see what happens. Henry canceled the order because he thinks they're unnecessary, and the president and his advisors were convinced that long-range, high-altitude heavy bombers would be the decisive weapon in a war that's going to be dominated this time around by air power. They wanted 12,000 of these bombers to attack Germany's heartland and targeting military installations, bridges, factories, etc. They chose the B-17 Flying Fortress from Boeing Airplane Company and the B-24 Liberator. That wasn't originally made by Ford Motor Company. It is made by Ford, a Consolidated Aircraft. Here's Henry. Henry Ford stated in May 1940 that if in the event that war came close to threatening the United States, his company could, under his control and that of his staff, and no interference from government agencies, I don't think Henry's a big fan of the government, swing into the production of 1,000 airplanes of a standard design a day. Now, this is Henry saying that, but also realize as this goes along that Henry Ford is not the man he once was, and he's slipping physically and perhaps mentally as well. After the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, his son Edsel, along with public opinion, convinced Henry, his father, that the time had come to choose sides. And Edsel strongly believes that we need to support our country in the entering of World War II. Now, Henry will reluctantly give in, and Ford soon ended car production to shift into a war focus. Henry had built a summer camp for boys of deceased or disabled veterans from World War I, known as Camp Willow Run, named after a creek that ran through the fields. It was shut down after the 1941 session for the Willow Run bomber plant, and the plant contained 1,450 acres. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A session, and I'll get to them after I'm done going through the slideshow. And Henry says something about that, how little time it took to tear down what was there and how long it took him to develop the orchard. The B-17 had a 6-year history of design, development, testing, and limited production. Excuse me, the twin-finned high-wing B-24 with its dual bomb bays and tricycle landing gear debuted in 1939 as a repurposed land model of Consolidated's bulky flying boats. Handcrafted versions were pressed into service in England, but the San Diego company lacked resources and methods for high volume production of the largest, most complex airplane ever designed. Still, aviation industry leaders scoffed when the War Department chose Ford Motor Company to mass produce Liberators. During a 1941 inspection tour of Consolidated plant with Edsel Ford, Charles Sorensen, the head of production for Ford Motor Company, criticized the operations as labor-intensive procedures. There was no sequence or orderly flow of materials, no sense of forward motion, no reliance on machine parts. Nothing was standard. They were producing a custom-made plane put together as a tailor would cut and fit a suit of coats. No two were alike. And Sorensen stayed up all night producing a B-24 assembly process on the back of Coronado hotel placemats. His sketches embrace the two fundamentals of mass production: standardized interchangeable parts and continuous orderly flow, punctuated by stops at assembly stations where workers and machines performed repetitive tasks, sequential assembly of the plane's principal sections, and they were each fabricated in a choreographed progression through separate self-contained cells. Sections include the center wing, outer wing and wingtips, fuselage, flight deck, nose and tails, and overhead cranes would hoist and put the completed sections together. The same way cars were put together, but on a grand scale. And they're going to have to convert an automobile manufacturing plant, for an airplane manufacturing plant, and not just any airplane, one that is of quite a large size. Sorensen reviewed his concept at breakfast with Edsel, and here we have Edsel Ford right here, who responded enthusiastically. Did Henry II, that's Henry Ford's grandson, Edsel's son. His two sons accompanied him on the trip. They're going to California. They all signed off on a sketch that Sorensen created. They presented the plan to Consolidated President Reuben Fleet and George Meade, procurement director for the Advisory Council for National Defense, who countered with an offer to produce 1,000 set of wings. "We'll build the whole plane or nothing," Charles Sorensen said, accompanied by the outlandish claim that Ford would assemble new B-24s every hour. And Charlie Sorensen is head of production at Ford Motor Company. His nickname is Cast Iron Charlie. So he's not an easy man, but he's a very knowledgeable man, and he becomes very close to Edsel. The whole plane it would be, with agreement that Ford would truck B-24 parts and finished sections, those are called knockdowns, to consolidated plants in San Diego and Fort Worth, and to Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa. Consolidated main control over the design changes, and so did the Army Air Corps, renamed U.S. Army Air Force in June 1941. Ford had no say in the matter. Production chaos ensued. And by the way, Edsel Ford becomes president of Ford Motor Company. I think it was in 1919. And certainly he gradually would get more power, but originally his father greatly kept his thumb on him. And that just is a book about the B-24 Liberators. I liked the picture, and I thought you might like to see what was going on and their opinion of the B-24 Liberator. So Charles Sorensen shuttled 70-man teams of engineers and draftsmen back and forth on a 2,300-mile trip apart from Ford headquarters to Consolidated in San Diego to immerse themselves in the B-24 designs, engineering's parts and components. To their dismay, they covered that the engineering drawings for the big bomber were useless. All this work they put in, and they're useless, incomplete and filled with discrepancies. Cast Iron Charlie, remember that's his nickname, had two Liberators flown to Dearborn, where they dismantled piece by piece. 1,000-member tool design group worked around the clock 7 days a week for almost a year to create 3-dimensional schematics of the planes. Listen to this, 30,000 separate components. And there's so many numbers, and occasionally they conflict, but they are great. They generated 5 million square feet of blueprints in the process. Their work guided custom designs of 1,600 machine tools and 11,000 fixtures, some 60 feet tall, that would stamp, mill, drill, broach, and grind parts to thousandths of an inch tolerance, with each repeatable precision. Here we go. Here's the manufacturing plant for the B-24s. Special equipment had to be designed to adapt plane making to Ford's assembly line. So you're going to look here and you're going to see the L-shaped factory, and they have a landing field, and they have lots of other land out there. So they had to they just can't convert it in a few days. They have to have special equipment. Sorensen's going to retain Albert Kahn. He's a renowned industrial architect, to design a factory that would adapt Ford's assembly line techniques to mass production of a giant aircraft. This isn't something that's typically done. The interior of it was 80 acres. On April 18th, 1941, 5 weeks after receiving an initial $3.4 million contract to build B-24 sub-assemblies, Ford broke ground for the plant. It was dedicated less than 2 months later, shortly before Henry Ford finally consented to the very first contract between the United Auto Workers and Ford Motor Company. Mr. Ford did not like unions, and he made sure that he and his right-hand man, Harry Bennett, broke many of them up. It was dedicated 5 weeks after that initial contract, he broke ground for the plant, dedicated less than 2 months later. There's a contract between the United Auto Workers and Ford Motor Company, and the last load of concrete for the adjoining Miles Square Airport was poured on December 4th, 3 days before Pearl Harbor. The resulting factory was one of the largest factories, not just in the United States, but in the entire world, occupying a space of more than 7 million square feet. Ford Motor was building the world's largest factory at Willow Run near Detroit at a cost of $47 million, worth about $755 million in today's economy. Edsel, and eventually, I believe it's going to, oh yeah, here we are. Edsel Ford had an agreement from the government. They would reimburse Ford for the total amount. The Army Air Force would ultimately invest $2 million in facilities and equipment. Well, how does it go at first? Let's see what happens. 38 tons of steel, structural steel, 5 million bricks, and 6 months later, they began churning out parts while the equipment was still being installed and roofs and walls remained unfinished. The first section of an 850-acre airfield adjoining the plant opened 3 days before Pearl Harbor, signaling the Liberator's primary war mission. Long-range flights over the Pacific waters to bomb networks of enemy-held islands, stretching from Australia to Guadalcanal and to the Japanese mainland, some 3,000 miles away. It was over 67 feet long with a wingspan of 110 feet. And realize there's a slight discrepancy here because Ford Motor Company is taking it over. Consolidated started it, and their sizes are a little different. It's not always standardized. Remember this as well. It had a wingspan of 110 feet, 4 engines with the combined power to equal 56 Ford V8s. It could fly 300 miles per hour for over 3,000 miles with a payload equivalent to 8,000 pounds of TNT. And there it is in all its glory. Ford struggled to get, and this is when I say Ford, this is Edsel Ford. He struggles to get Willow Run running at full potential. The government's constant design changes to the B-24 were particularly troubling. And sometimes they would rely on what the soldiers said, like maybe they needed to add a ball turret gunner, so they would add that person. But it also meant that you had to change the assembly line because now it's designed for something else. The government's constant design changes to the B-24 were particularly troubling. Ford's production methods depended on a fixed design. Every time you changed something, it required expensive and time-consuming updates to the assembly line. This is continuing into 1943. You all know that Pearl Harbor takes place on December 7th, 1941. And there are all kinds of issues. There's not places for people to stay. They're on the edges of their property. They will send up rudimentary campgrounds, places where septic would overflow. They're not part, they would join and put their tents or find a very affordable but not very desirable place to live. There wasn't housing built. Well, why not? Why is this continuing? And why are critics starting to call this not Willow Run, but Will It Run? Well, there's some reasons. They didn't have adequate housing. They didn't know that war rationing and restrictions from the war, they wouldn't be able to have people from Detroit coming in to work in the factory. It was like 27 miles a day. I think eventually there's a road through there away so that both those directions, there's rationing, there's not enough gas. There's not a way to directly get people involved there to help. So for numerous reasons, it really was not successful in first. Willow Run's problems became under a microscope in April 1942 regarding housing for workers. And again, in February of 1943, when Senator Harry Truman, and there he is right there, visited the committee, visited the plant. Now in 1942, Roosevelt visited there and talked about war production. But Truman is, Willow's Run's problems come under a microscope in April 1942 regarding housing, and again in February 1943, when Senator Harry Truman comes to visit the plant. He headed up a presidential committee charged with eliminating wartime production waste, and Willow Run's struggles worried him. Board President Edsel Ford and his team explained the difficulties with design changes, which they did understand, but they didn't want, some of the senators didn't want to let the men down, so they had to keep on going back and making them. They wouldn't be successful. They wouldn't fit correctly. They would have to redo the production line. And Truman was there. He's not pleased. And this is what happens. Truman doesn't want excuses. He wants finished bombers, and they doesn't want to retool all of the B-24s. So remember, for a couple of years, we hardly have any housing. They're still putting up the buildings. And by the way, even when they do put up housing, it's pretty basic, but it's going to make things better. There's war rationing. They can't get things back and forth. Let's go on. In addition, Ford was continually challenged by a shortage of labor throughout the plant's existence. A lot of the people are going to go back to work other places. They're going to join the war effort. At its peak, Ford employed nearly 50,000 workers. Many of the chosen individuals had to go under a very steep learning curve to become productive employees. And while most were successful in this endeavor, with so many trainees on the shop floor, production was hindered. It was impacted because there were so many, not enough time to train them. But this was just part of the labor issue. Willow Run's remote location from population centers initially daily hindered commute. So the highway was built to the west of Detroit, that's now part of I-94. But at the time, it wasn't easy to get across from Detroit out to Willow Run and realize that there had been nothing there with Willow Run when this is all taking possible. Also, many of the new workers came from other areas, not just Detroit or other parts of Michigan, and they needed places to live. But by early 1942, there are no rental rooms to be found within a 15-mile radius of Willow Run. As a result, the entire town was built almost overnight, called Willow Village, and it had dorms, and they are not luxury dorms, for single workers and small houses for family. Upon reaching peak employment by the end of 1943, Willow Village was providing temporary shelter for 15,000, a population greater than its home city of Ypsilanti. And by the way, people would come up with their little motor homes. I don't think they called them that. They would come, campers, husbands and wives would come across from different places. They Ford Motor particularly recruited down south. People would come from everywhere. And this is part of Willow Village, by the way. And I will be taking questions at the end. Well, here we go. I just want to do a little aside here. Lots of women go to work for Ford Motor Company in the factory. Job opportunities are great. And Rose Will Monroe was working at Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant when she was chosen to appear in a promotional film for war bonds. That is how she became a real-life Rosie the Riveter, as depicted in the colorful "We Can Do It" posters. Rose Will Monroe had been left a widow with 2 young children after her husband was killed in a car accident. She joined the workforce to fulfill a call to arms and to support her family. And I put this in here because I wanted to represent all the women that go to work during the war and those plants there. And this is, and that woman that several people will claim Rosie the Riveter, she is one of them, and she ends up on the cover of Look magazine. And that's a Norman Rockwell print. And he wanted to show what it was like for a working class woman. That incarnation of her that comes later on with the scarf tied around her head, and it became popular on posters, and she looks a little more less working class. That came into popularity in the 70s. This is what is popular here right then, is Rose Will Monroe, this cover. And not just women, but people of color, African Americans, Blacks, will get jobs there. Not to say they don't face prejudice, and both, can't speak with certainty if women and African Americans were making this same pay at the time. Many other plants did not offer it equally. But there are opportunities for people in the factory, opportunities that frequently aren't given to other groups. And as I mentioned, they did try to get people to come from the South as well. So let's talk about these gentlemen here. As you probably know, on the left, that's Henry Ford. And there is Charles Lindbergh. So how does he, well, people are a little suspicious about these men for them accepting that award from Hitler way before the war started and never apologizing on it. There's Ford, there's Lindbergh. And Lindbergh he resigns when there's that outcry. I think he was in an Army Air Corps or whatever they were calling it then, reserve. And he resigns when he is in part of that because people are not accepting of him as being part of that government, being part of the Army Air Corps Reserve. So he will resign, but he and Ford had met before. They had things in common, America first, interested in not going into war. And so Ford offers his services, asked for his services from Lindbergh at Ford Motor Company. So this is something they kind of agreed on ahead of time. I kind of botching what I said here, but he's not welcome in the Army Air Corps. So, and he had resigned from the reserves of that, can't get back in. So he is going to become a technical advisor and a test pilot at Willow Run. And he and Henry do have those things in common. He is a brilliant test pilot. And at first he had to get used to the way Ford did things. There is one story about him being up there in the air and he doesn't realize, he thinks he has quarter tank of oxygen left. But what it did was actually leak. And Ford is up on this test flight and he basically didn't think he was going to make it because he blacked out because there was a leak, didn't realize he was using the oxygen. And there's some interesting stories about Lindbergh in there as well. So yes, he goes to work a little over a year at Ford Motor Company at Willow Run as a test pilot and technical advisor. Now in 1941, Edsel Ford begins to have one of the many agonizing attacks that would cause him to double over in pain. And I'm just going to stop a minute. Here he is, Edsel Ford. Charlie Sorensen, the head of production for Ford Motor Company, Willow Run. And this is William Kunston, who is the head of General Motors. And this is autographed to them by William Kunston. Now, Edsel Ford begins to he had had one of the many agonizing attacks. He had had them before that caused him to double over in pain. Edsel would return to work and keep working through the pain. And that would be agonizing, debilitating pain. Sorensen would talk about holding his hand when they were away someplace and thinking he's not going to make it. And realize these two men are the two men that are actually producing. They are, along with all the soldiers that serve and all the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force that serves. But Sorensen will design that assembly line. He is in charge of the production. Edsel is in charge of the business and making sure this gets done. And Edsel Ford is under unbelievable tension. His doctor thought he had stomach ulcers, but they didn't seem to know how to treat them. And the doctors don't pursue any further explanation because they know how busy Edsel is. In the spring of 1942, Edsel suffered another attack of abdominal pain, and he quietly checks into the Henry Ford Hospital. And he looked so gaunt, so thin, like a man much older and in acute pain and exhausted. And his wife keeps on telling him to resign, to stay home, because he's chronic pain, and his doctors are going to tell him that if you don't stop working like this, you're going to die. Well, he decided to open him up, and what they found was that he was full of tumors. They removed what they could, and they took out about half of his stomach. Edsel was told if he returned to work, as I told you, it would kill him. And the thing is, they didn't know him much back then as now, and they let those tumors go for a long time. And Edsel is basically being told, if you work, you will die. This is your death sentence. And yet he's still going on. He wants them to produce those B-24s, to have one come off the assembly line every hour. He returned with just a few pain pills, with only a few people knowing what was really going on with him. Let's talk about Willow Run for a minute, and then let's talk about Edsel, because he is in agony right now. He is in physical pain beyond belief. But his belief, he has a belief in these B-24s that are being built, and not by a hand, the ones that are coming off by machine. And they are calling it Willow Run. Everybody's exploring it. The government wants to know what's going on. And listen to this, things will get better. Only 56 airplanes were built in all of 1942. But as 1943 arrived, the problems got solved. Well, they got better. They weren't perfect. And Willow Run turned a corner. Numbers steadily climbed throughout the year. Ford built 37 planes in January, 70 in February, 96 in March, and 146 in April. On November 3rd, 1943, employees celebrated as Willow Run turned out its 1000th B-24 bomber. By 1944, the company was making 48.5% of all B-24s produced. In 1945, the figure had increased to 80%. Mass production on this scale, assembly of more than 1 million plane parts held together by thousands and thousands of rivets done at stations extending 3,000 feet had never been attempted. By the end of the war, the plant was turning out 540 the 4-engine planes a month, meaning the plane was assembled every 59, just over 59 and a half minutes. Isn't that amazing? Going from making them by hand, hardly churning them out, to seeing them being very successful. And look at those B-24s. Some other things that Edsel and Charlie Thornton are responsible for: employee training, general employee training when they came to Ford Motor Company, and more specific employee training for the skill or new skill they're going to learn. Employee training was a constant process at Willow Run and on-site classrooms. Newly hired workers sat through orientation lectures on the aircraft industry in general, the B-24's specific importance to the war, and the dire consequences should the Allies lose the fight. Specialized employees, riveters, for example, they received training in these classrooms as well. Now, we're talking about the last few months of Edsel's life, and you're saying to me, still not convinced that Ford Motor Company saved the world. We're going to continue. He's going to die in 1943, May 26. Keep that in the back of your mind. The last few months of Edsel's life were spent in severe physical and emotional pain. And here we go. Here's Henry Ford, Edsel Ford. Father's older. Edsel Ford is severely ill. His father could be very oppositional, very critical, and very influenced by Harry Bennett, a man that was not above a lot of underhand dealings and could manipulate Henry Ford quite easily. His father was suffering the effects of dementia. That's our best educated guess. And for many years been under the influence of a man, the one I just mentioned, Harry Bennett, Henry Ford's head of security and right-hand man, a man used to break up labor unions. And how he would do it? Physical violence. April 16th, 1943 was Edsel Ford's last day at Willow Run. He saw the 200th Liberator near completion and watched a bomber take off with test pilots. Edsel will return home, and he never comes back. He's not well enough. And he never again left. In May of 1943, all of Edsel's late May, all of Edsel's children return home to be near their father. Edsel dies on May 26, 1943. He never lived to see Willow Run reach its full potential. But you know what? The assembly line was just getting going. He and Charles Sorensen believed in that. Those B-24 Liberators are going to go over there. And yes, there's times that's horrible. I'm not a proponent of war when people die. But those B-24s bombing some areas, that amount of force and air power heavily contributed to the success of the United States in World War II. And this man right there, Edsel Ford and Charles Sorensen, head of production, their shared vision. Willow Run hit its stride in 1944, just after Edsel dies. In April, employees in 2 9-hour shifts working 6 days a week produced 453 airplanes in 468 hours, a production rate equal to 1 finished B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. And it's even going to get lower. Nobody could thought that could get done. They were churning out maybe 12 a month that consolidated because it wasn't standardized. It didn't have an assembly line. And now they've got some housing, not perfect housing, but they've got housing. Things are going so much better. Charles Sorensen's brash 1 plane every hour and claim was no longer an empty boast. Willow Run and its workers met their goal. The plant turned out 8,645 Liberators versus 9,808 manufactured by 4 factories of Consolidated, Douglas Aircraft, and North American Aviation. Edsel Ford dies, and what happens at Ford Motor Company? By 1944, Henry Ford tried to take over the reins at Ford, but he was no shape to do so. Ultimately, the decision was made to pull his grandson out of the service, Henry Ford II. Following the German surrender, the last B-24 Liberator was named the Henry Ford, left the factory at the end of June. On September 21st, after the Japanese surrender, Henry Ford resigned as president of Ford Motor Company. He had been manipulated greatly by Harry Bennett. Harry Bennett is there, and he will be fired. And Henry Ford II is named president of Ford Motor Company. And Bennett threatens the head of a gentleman that they had brought in from the FBI. And Henry's down in his office downstairs. And lots of people believe Harry had a lot of shenanigans, a lot of illegal ways, in addition to the money that he made. And he always had brute force. There was a lot of brute force, unfortunately, at Ford Motor Company, along with Harry Bennett. And Edsel tried very hard to get rid of him, but it wasn't successful until this time. But he gets into it with this man that he brought in from the FBI. I think his name, I try to remember his last name, but whatever, Henry Ford's down in his office burning papers. Not Henry Ford, Harry Bennett is burning papers. This FBI guy goes down there, and Bennett pulls out his gun and threatening this former FBI gentleman, and he said, "I'll shoot you." And the FBI guy says to Harry Bennett, "I'll shoot you right through the heart," because he's busily burning, and he's given time to burn all these papers, which show us that he had been up to no good, very long time. But Henry Ford II is going to come in and name president of Ford Motor Company. And there are people that believe that Eleanor Ford, Edsel Ford's wife, and perhaps Clara Ford, also told Henry, I know Clara told to bring Henry Ford II in, but Eleanor threatens to sell, Clara says bring in Henry Ford II. Eleanor threatens to sell, this is the rumor, her Ford Motor Company stock, which would put it out there to the general public. if he did not resign. And of course, the goal, not just to have him not there, but to have Harry Bennett, who had worked at Ford Motor Company since like about 1917, 1990, started in the art department and rose quickly to power and did some extremely unethical things. So that was a triumph. At the war's end, remember, this is all, by the way, owned by the government, not owned by Ford Motor Company. And they chose not to exercise its option to buy the Willow Run plant. Automaker Kaiser Frazier's Corporation moved into the factory. Kaiser Frazier produced some 739,000 cars at Willow Run between 1947 and 1953, when the company moved all its operations to, they acquired Wiley's Overland, and they moved all their operations to the Wiley's factory in Toledo, Ohio. General Motors leased and then purchased Willow Run. General Motors first built transmissions at the plant and later automobiles, including Chevrolet's Corvair and Nova models. After nearly 60 years at the site, General Motors ended its Willow Run plant operations not till 2010. In 2013, the Yankee Air Museum, museum, was able to purchase 144,000 square feet of the plant. The building is currently being used to house and protect part of the museum's large aircraft acquisition. In 2017, I got to go to the little area that they had gotten back of Willow Run. They did not have a B-24 Liberator. They had part of what would have been the equivalent of a B-24 in the Navy. And I don't know what happened after the pandemic and how much further that's gone. There's only a handful of B-24s left in the world. I believe there's one in New Orleans, maybe in Canada, maybe in Great Britain. But I do hope that someplace there's one to see these workhorses. They were not glamorous. And those men that got in there and fought, there's no luxury heating, no air conditioning, no climate control. It was a very, very dangerous aircraft. I'm not saying it wasn't safely built, but they're very vulnerable. And they were used in they were used in Romania over Ploesti. I'm going to say, I don't think I'm saying that right, to get rid of the Nazi war machines' oil producing places. The first time something went awry and so many people were, and the B-24s were killed, and I'll answer that in a minute. And then in 1944, they were successful and were able to heavily damage those oil manufacturing places in Romania, and that was done by the B-24s. And I won't, I'll get back to everybody in a minute. Okay, some of my information comes from this book called The Arsenal of Democracy by A.J. Bain. It came out in 2014. We sell it. I would have made it our book of our month, but I already did. FDR, Detroit, and an epic quest to arm an America at war. And in my opinion from this, though Edsel Ford certainly doesn't come across as perfect, he comes across as a hero. I'd say that about Charles Sorensen too. And by the way, Charles Sorensen, after Edsel dies and Henry Ford takes over, he does resign from Ford Motor Company. He was never fired. That was a rumor that was put out there by Harry Bennett. And he says he's just going to retire and go back to Florida, his home there. But guess what? He gets another job offer and he doesn't. And what do I have here? Okay, that's me. Why? Well, that's me because but you can see me here. But that's at the Detroit Institute of Art. And the reason I showed it is because that's Edsel Ford. And that picture is in the Detroit Museum of Art, and I convinced, because he was a big supporter of it, and I convinced the security guard to take my picture because I will be honest, Edsel Ford is my favorite Ford or Edison person to talk about. I don't think he gets enough credit. I tried to be as objective as possible about him, but it was a thrill just to stand near that. Here is some of the resources I use. I reread this book. I read it when it came out in 2014. I just reread it, but there's so much in here. I'll be honest, I should have done a 3-part presentation on this. I couldn't put everything in. There is so much that happens, so much that goes on in that time period, such a brief time period. But so much happened. And by the way, in 1946, the last B-24 was hauled out, supposed to be put by the Edsel Ford VFW, which eventually was supposed to be a tribute to him. The Fords show up, Henry and Clara Ford. But unfortunately, after 4 years of being exposed to the elements, it basically just fell apart, so heavily damaged, they had to take it down. There's one book about Edsel Ford. It's like Edsel Ford, The Forgotten Son or something like that, is not currently in print. So you'd have to buy a used book. He deserves a new biography. Not that that one wasn't fine. And so some places real quick, the Ford Fund and the Arsenal of Democracy. There's at the investors.com news management, leaders in success. Edsel Ford revolutionized aircraft manufacturing. Oh, there's just so many places. If there's something specific, Assembly Magazine, the Henry Ford, lots of different Henry Ford sites, government, the National Archives, the Detroit Historical Society, the Ann Arbor Historical Society, all these places did so much work. And I would say I only got to touch the very basic information here. And so I would urge you to go out and get this book. It's not working because it's blue, but it's the Arsenal of Democracy. Let me stop the share and go full screen. Here I am. I'm going to take your questions or your chats. Packard built the Merlin engine and did such a great job that some things did. The Packard Merlins were better than the Rolls-Royce Merlins. Thank you, Dan. I wouldn't have known that. And another one, Gordon says that Harold Brock, who worked with old Henry, said he had a stroke in 38 and 42, but never went to a doctor. This dropped him mentally. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And the great Albert Kahn, this is Daniel, architect of Willow Run and architect of Detroit, was Jewish, but did build over 1,000 projects for Ford despite Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, another Henry Ford paradox. Oh my gosh, Henry Ford is full of so many contradictions. Just real quick before we end, and if you have any questions, let me know right now, okay? Because I'd be happy to answer them, but I just want to tell you something real quick. Of the 18,482 Liberators built during the war, I told you that, 8,685 rolled out of Willow Run. Total of 80,774 workers, 61% men, 39% women staffed the bomber plant with peak employment of 42,331. The cost to make each Liberator dropped because of the assembly line get improving and got better and better. And the men that believed were Edsel Ford and Charles Sorensen. And what else did the Ford Motor Company also build? 57,851 aviation engines at the Rouge, plus 277,896 Jeeps, 93,217 trucks, 26,954 tank engines, 2,718 tanks, 87,390 aircraft generators, and I'm going to keep on going. They built things out of the Kingsford lumber mill. They built 4,291 invasion gliders. I didn't give you even all the information. Please buy the book. Please come visit us. And if you are an Edsel Ford admirer, like I am, let's talk. I could talk about him all day. There is so much. It is not without controversy, but I hope that you can see the great contributions of Edsel Ford and what he accomplished. Made me choke up. I'm such a nerd. Detroit is the Motor City. I had a chance to go there. What a great place to visit. If you're not visiting Edison Ford Winter Estates, go visit the Henry Ford, go visit Yankee Air Museum, go visit Greenfield Village, go visit Detroit Museum of Art, but support places that are historic. And guess what? I forgot to put my screenshot up there that told you what I was doing next month. Oh, thank you. I always appreciate your comments. And I had Carol saying that another Edsel admirer, the best thing they ever did was get rid of Harry Bennett, part of the typical American labor history. That is absolutely true. So next month, I'm going to be a week later, and definitely we're not going to have any of these issues again. Oh gosh, hold on, because somehow that screen didn't come up, but I'll tell you the exact date when it is. But I am going to be talking about another man that I absolutely greatly admire, and that is on November 16th. But check our website, it's at 10:30, and I am going to be talking about the great Roberto Clemente. And I'm going to do an overview of his whole life, but I'm going to focus on here in Fort Myers. I did do that baseball discussion. I talked about him, and you don't have to be passionate about baseball to be passionate about Roberto Clemente, because if you feel passionately about Edsel Ford, then you will also find another hero in Roberto Clemente, another man that died doing good for others. If I don't have any further questions, please join me next month. And thank you so much for your contributions, and go out there and do some reading. And I'm always available to chat. Did I have a question? Did I have any questions? Nope, no chat there. Questions and answers? Nope. Anybody else? Well, I'm not seeing anything else, so I'm just going to tell you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for your kind comments, everybody, and I will see you next month. And again, my apologies for not getting on yesterday. Thanks. Harvey Firestone, that's a great suggestion. I'll do that in the future. I would love to do one on Harvey Firestone. Thank you, Carol, for the suggestion. And I also would, I've got a couple people coming up. Thank you. That'll be one of them in the next 2 or 3. Thanks. I'm signing off. Thanks for your support. Bye-bye.